Episode 2 starts out with a flashback of when the kids are all smaller and they're talking at the dinner table. And number 5 chimes up that he wants to start time traveling, but Reginald says you're not ready for that at all. Being a young kid who thinks he knows everything, 5 says, yeah, I am, but Reginald still says, you're not ready for that. 5 storms out and starts time traveling, and everything's going well. He's traveling to different eras until all of a sudden he travels to the wrong era where the world's ended, and that's where he was stuck for all those years. We return in present day where he's in Vanya's living room, and he tells Vanya exactly what happened, but she's trying to make sense of it all, and it's not really clicking. He tries to leave, but Vanya says, look, I've lost you once. I'm not going to lose you again. Why don't you just sleep at my house? He agrees, but he does end up leaving because he's being hunted by people. It's those same people from the diner, and they've shown up. They're 2 people named Hazel and Cha-Cha. They've got a briefcase and orders to get to number 5. They even say it's at one point, we've never had to hunt our own before. They check into a shitty motel, and it becomes evident that Hazel's not exactly a fan of his bosses and how cheap they've gotten recently. Now, they've located the tracking device that number 5 took out of his arm, and they did so before the cops could locate it. The cops have arrived at the donut shop and start asking questions to the woman that was working there that night, and she starts to explain everything, but then goes, do I have to explain this to you again? I mean, I already did this to the other cop. To which a female police officer says, what other cop? And that's when it clicks for Detective Patch, who ends up going around the back of the donut shop and catching Diego. She tells Diego that he can't keep doing this. He can't pretend to be a cop. It's obvious that these two know each other. Not only do they know each other, but they previously dated in some kind of capacity. Detective Patch ends up taking Diego down to the precinct where, through conversation, you learn that Diego was kicked out of the police academy. He basically lives and works as a vigilante now, trying to help the cops, but really just trying to serve the community when the cops aren't going to do it. But Detective Patch is pretty pissed and says, you need to stay away from my witnesses. Now, we'll get back to Diego and move on to Allison, who's going through a tough time because all she wants to do is see her daughter. She's supposed to have visitation rights, but had to come out here for the funeral, and she's kind of going through withdrawal a little bit. She tells Luther that she hopes one day he can meet him, and he's surprised that her daughter even knows who Luther is. She says, of course, I always told my daughter about her uncle up in the moon. But the moon is the farthest thing from Luther's mind because he's still convinced that somebody murdered their dad because of the monocle, even though all of the brothers and sisters are saying, dude, his heart just gave out, give it a rest. But Luther definitely has his suspicions and heads out to find Diego. He ends up heading to where Diego lives, and Diego lives in a boxing gym. In the basement, he basically trades off janitor work for rent, but Diego's not there. Luther starts snooping around and sees a boxing poster that Diego participated in, and it basically exonerates him because it's the exact same day as their father's death. Now, the last brother we haven't talked about is Klaus, who's having a tough time because he can talk to the dead, including his dead brother Ben. He wakes up to find Pogo asking him if he knows anything about this missing box that is very important. It's obviously the box that he stole from Reginald's office and then sold at a pawn shop. But being a good junkie, he just denies everything. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know where this box could be. If you remember, he pawned the box but threw a book that was in the box in a dumpster. And that's really what Pogo wants, is the book. Pogo says the items in that box were very important and very valuable, and if someone were to bring that back, they would be forgiven for what they did. But of course, Klaus is like, yeah, I don't know anything about it. Now, we're going to get to Klaus in a second because he's going to end up helping 5, who has brought this eyeball back from the future, and he thinks it's of vital importance to figuring out how exactly to solve the apocalypse. He takes to the company that made it, but they're not giving him any information because number 5 looks like a 12-year-old boy. So he enlists Klaus to play his father in this role so they could get the information to find out who exactly this eye belonged to. The issue is when he heads over with Klaus, they still won't give him the medical information. But Klaus has a plan, and he says, I can't believe you hit my son, and then he punches number 5. And then he grabs a snow globe and bashes over her head and says, I can't believe you assaulted me too. The doctor immediately grabs the phone and calls security, but Klaus grabs it and says, yeah, there's been an assault. Can you head up here? And then he hangs up and turns to the doctor and says, look, there's going to be 2 security guards that show up here, and we're just going to tell them that you beat the shit out of us unless we get these medical records. The doctor reluctantly looks up the information, but the issue is, whose ever eyeball that belongs to, yeah, it hasn't been made yet. As they're leaving, Klaus says, why are you so stressed? I mean, I guess it's because you're like 50 years old, but you actually look like you're 12. You haven't gotten laid yet. And he goes, I was with somebody for 30 years. Her name's Dolores. The issue I have is the world's going to end in 8 days, and someone in the next 7 days is going to lose an eyeball, and I need to start getting some answers to figure this thing out. So number 5 heads off, but Cha-Cha and Hazel, the 2 people that are looking for him, have located that driver who is in the coffee shop along with number 5. and they're torturing him for answers. They're convinced that this guy is Five and he's the person they're looking for, but obviously that's not the case. They finally, after torturing him enough times, come to the realization that this isn't Five. And the only information he can give them is that Five wanted the location of this department store. We'll get back to number 5 and Hazel and Cha-Cha in a second, but let's get back to the sisters Vanya and Allison, who have had a little bit of a blow-up in regards to Allison's daughter. She's kind of taking her anger out on Vanya and says, how would you know how it feels? You've never been in love with anybody, and you've never had a relationship. Vanya kind of blames her dad, and then Allison shoots back, well, did dad make you write that book? You're an adult. Start acting like it. Take responsibility. So Vanya heads home kind of depressed, but she's a violin teacher, and she has a new appointment. This adult named Leonard. He's pretty dorkish, unassuming, the kind of guy you would expect to want to learn violin at the age of, 35. He starts small talk with Vanya, asking if it's weird that he's wanting to learn violin at this old age, which of course she says no, and you come to find out that he wants to learn violin because of his father. He's really describing the relationship that Vanya had with her father, but this guy had a similar relationship with his father. And he's trying to understand music because his dad loved it. At the end of the lesson, Leonard tells her that he owns a wood shop and invites her there, but she's like, hey, maybe another time. Remember, they've only known each other for maybe like 45 minutes. It's kind of weird you're asking somebody out on a first date. Now, the other end of this blow-up was Allison, who ends up heading up to the attic to smoke a cigarette. And Pogo finds her there and says, yeah, I figured I'd find you here. You always came up here when you were upset. I want to show you something. He brings her into the room with all the surveillance tapes that her dad had collected throughout the years. She says it's hilarious because most families have home videos and photo albums, and we have surveillance tapes. Pogo apologizes, saying, I'm sorry, I thought this would make you feel better, but Allison says, look, it does. I just kind of find it amusing. Pogo says, look, you can watch as much as you want, just lock up, and she starts to watch all the videos, but then she puts in one videotape and just says, oh my God, Dad, and we can't see what's on the tape, but whatever it is pretty upsetting. Now, at this point, Diego has made it back to his basement in the boxing gym, and Leonard apologizes, saying, hey, I didn't know you had a fight that night. I'm sorry. And Diego says, well, I didn't know I had to let you know that I had a fight that night. Luther says, well, I just thought, and Diego cuts him off and says, I know what you thought. So that same night, number 5 heads to that department store that he ended up telling the truck driver about. And you come to learn that Dolores isn't a person. She was a damn mannequin. We're talking like Castaway, Tom Hanks, Wilson type. Like, that's the kind of relationship he had with this mannequin. Unfortunately for him, Cha-Cha and Hazel have also shown up, and they start shooting up the place. 5 is able to jump and avoid their shots and ends up escaping back to the house. And the next morning, Allison finds Luther and says, look, I have to show you something. You were right about Dad. As they head to the surveillance room, 5 is just arriving back and starts walking up the steps, and they're like, dude, you don't look so good. Are you all right? You need help with something? And he goes, there is absolutely nothing you could possibly help me with. And then you get a flashback to when 5 jumped forward in time. That eyeball that he found, well, Luther was holding it. The issue was Luther was dead, and 5 had to find all of his brothers and sisters' bodies spewed out across the rubble.